Wigwusin nitampa kanatawamag. Askatasquampson, mantapin wuni. All of those good things, many blessings, good medicine to you all. Neesu Wushuwunoag, Director General, Federation of Aboriginal Nations of the Americas. Happy to be back in touch with y'all. I know it's been a very, very long time since the last communication. Been very busy and a lot of progress. If you all have been following on social media, I'm sure you saw that Kasike Maguatu and I both finished our law school degrees from Roger Williams University School of Law, and have a much more comprehensive and foundational understanding of just how the law functions, not only here in the U.S., quote-unquote U.S., but around the world and in relation between the two. And it's interesting, I've also noticed that around this time of year, Thunder Moon, Green Corn, that's when we usually have a kind of rise in sort of attacks on what we say or what we've been up to or what we look like. So just figured it would be a good time just to touch base again, clarify a few foundational things that we've discussed over the years. Wow, it's been a while now since we've been communicating, huh? And just clarifying, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people that are jumping into knowledge that perhaps they have some indigenous heritage that wasn't shared with them or that they were misled about. And of course, that is fertile ground for individuals with malicious intent to start adding in misinformation or start to attack people based upon colonial concepts that they're still operating under. So today, just going to look at seven, maybe 8, just general points of clarity. Points of clarity, that's what we'll call this one, points of clarity. For those individuals who are coming into information around American Indians in this place that they call the Americas, and in particular in this place that they call America, or the United States. So first, this is probably going to set off a whole bunch of people, but you know, that's what the truth's supposed to do, especially when you're dealing with lack of it. So the first is that Moors are not Indians. Moors aren't Indians. I'm just going to read, because in the past I've read the Black's Law Dictionary definition of an Indian. It's the Aboriginal inhabitants of North America. But this time I just want to read the definition of Moor. And this is from Black's Law, 2nd edition. And the definition of a Moor is an officer in the Isle of Man who summons the courts for the several sheetings. The officer is similar to the English bailiff of 100. So in law, a Moor is an officer of the Isle of Man. I'm not too familiar with the Isle of Man. You should look it up. But that's what a Moor is in Black's Law under definition. Rather, an Indian is an Aboriginal inhabitant of North America. So from the legal side of things, a Moor is not an Indian. It's not. From the historical side of things, Moors aren't Indians because Moors were involved in helping European colonization of the Americas. Now, that's not to say every Moor was involved in that. And that's not to say that all Moors are bad. We don't deal with extremes in the work that we do. We deal with facts and the truth. But there were Moors that were involved in and supported European colonization of both the Americas and of West Africa and of other places as well, I'm sure. So just historically, it's not true. And then when you get down to it, there are actual Moorish bloodlines, people that can trace themselves back to the individuals who in the 1700s were self-identifying as Moors. And those bloodlines are going to be different from Indians. Was there engagement between? Of course. There was all kinds of engagement before European colonization, and during, and after. Well, we're still in it, so. But the baseline being, in the first point, Moors aren't Indians. And we did a video a while back discussing this same point. So I'm not going to go too much further into it, but Moors aren't Indians. So that's the baseline there. Now, secondly, after examining that Moors on Indians, we want to look at the fact that race itself, this construct called race, black people, white people, all that, that's a social construct. It hasn't been around for that long, to be very honest, and is much more prevalent here in the Western society, than it is in other places. When you go other places, I've had a little bit of a chance to travel. They're not so much based upon the color of your skin as they are who your ancestors are and were and where they come from and all of that sort of stuff. So race is a social construct, and you can actually trace its introduction into American society here in the U.S. After the Bacon's Rebellion of 1675-1676. So I encourage everyone to go look that up, but you'll see that before the Bacon's Rebellion, it was Europeans, African heritage folks, and Indians. And then after the Bacon's Rebellion, as they're trying to figure out a way to keep marginalized and oppressed populations from banding together, that's when these racial classifications come up and the term white gets introduced. And of course, once white gets introduced, then you have everything else that's not white, right? And it just runs the gamut. Negro, black, African American, Latino, Hispanic, all of these are not white. But the point being, race, the concept of race, was introduced into American society after the Bacon's Rebellion of 1675-1676, which is at the same time as the King Philip's War, 1675-1676. And that's when race gets introduced. So therefore, operating through a racial lens when you're talking about first contact and rights to lands makes absolutely no sense, because they weren't even operating in that paradigm when European colonization first started. So when we start to talk about whose lands these are, you have to completely remove any sort of racial lens that you're operating through, and specifically engage through bloodlines, heritage, who people actually are. But that brings me back once again to the second point. Race is a social construct that was introduced into American society after the Bacon's Rebellion and after the King Philip's War. And if we're starting to talk about Aboriginal in first contact, then we really shouldn't be operating through a racial lens at all. Which brings me to my third point, which is relevant today. Phenotype is not indicative of one's indigenous heritage. How we look today does not mean that we are not or are indigenous. People look different today. Ancestors meet people from different places and have children, and the children come out looking different than the parents did sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. Or the parents come together and they look different, so the children look like the parents, but they don't look like either of the parents' ancestors. So phenotype is something that changes. So you can't say to this day that phenotype is necessarily or expressly indicative of one's indigenous heritage, whether they have it or whether they do not have it. Phenotypical characteristics can be witnessed all across the planet. Having a broad nose doesn't mean that you're from a specific location. Australians have broad noses. Is anyone arguing that they're Africans? You also can't necessarily tell by skin tone where someone's at, other than a general area like European. Yeah, but Eastern or Western. So you get into all of these sorts of nuances that come along with phenotype. But one thing that we should know for certain is that phenotype is not expressly indicative of someone's indigenous heritage, whether they have it or whether they don't have it. So this should cut out all of the nonsense about, oh, you're a fake African. And this should also cut out all of the nonsense about, oh, you're a $5 Indian. All of that needs to be wiped out. We should be finding out who people are. I want to know who you are. I don't even want to know what your necessary status is. I want to know who you are, because if we're getting back to traditional way of doing things, there was no status, there was no tribal roles, there was none of that. There was you and your people and who you were with and who you were from. So phenotype does not determine indigenous heritage in any way. It might share whether you look related to your particular people, but that doesn't necessarily express indigenous heritage, if you get what I'm saying. We shouldn't be telling people, oh, you've got dark skin, so you must be African. We shouldn't be telling people, oh, your eyes are a certain shape, so you must be, and it should be Mongolian if I'm not mistaken, not Mongoloid. But we just shouldn't be doing those sorts of things. We shouldn't be saying to someone, oh, your skin's too light or your nose is too thin. You must be a $5 Indian. We shouldn't be doing things like that. We should be getting to know whose people's ancestors are. And on the flip side, we should be able to articulate who our ancestors are without relying upon race or phenotype as justification. We all should know. Everyone should know who their ancestors are. So those are the first three. First, Moors aren't Indians. Just not. Are there Indians that have Moorish bloodlines? I'm sure. Are there Moors that have indigenous bloodlines? I'm sure. But you can't just flat across the board say Moors are Indians. And you also shouldn't be saying that Indians are, all of that stupidity that goes on. Secondly, race is a social construct that was introduced into the American society after the Bacon's Rebellion and King Philip's War. Third, phenotype is not indicative or does not expressly indicate one's indigenous heritage. Which leads us to fourth, and this really ties to, like I was saying, the opportunity to learn more about the law. Indian is a political status. It's not a racial designation. Indian is like foreign national. So let me ask you, what color skin tone does a foreign national have? What religion did foreign nationals practice before they came to America? See how outrageous it sounds? Well, that's how we should be treating Indian as well. It's a political status. This is Morton v. Mancari, 1974, I believe. So you can look that up. But it's a political status. It's a political status. It's not a racial designation. In which case, there should be no such thing as black Indians or white Indians or Mongoloid Indians. It's an Indian. An Indian. It's an Aboriginal inhabitant of the Americas, and it goes based upon blood heritage back to those people that were here. So it doesn't matter what you look like today. Doesn't matter what you wear today. Doesn't matter how you dress. Doesn't even matter. Indian is a person by blood. Your bloodline is your Indian. Now, you'll hear Indians, once you get into traditional culture, say you're not acting like an Indian. And what we mean by that is, yeah, you got the blood, but where's the culture? Where's the tradition? Where's the language? Where's any of that? Where are you actually conducting yourself like you're from an indigenous nation or an indigenous culture? But the term Indian itself in American law is simply a political designation. And it's specific to people who have blood heritage back to the people that were here before Europeans and Moors came here colonizing. So Indian's not a racial designation. It's a political status similar to foreign national. Once again, just replace Indian with foreign national and start asking all of those stupid questions and see if they make any sense. Okay, so that's four. Let's look at our fifth one. And this is important because, once again, this comes in with the misinformation, and this is going to tie to some points that I make after this. There was never any united Aboriginal nation like that. Generic. We got to get rid of generics generally. Get rid of generic language generally. There were nations here. And then those nations were broken down based upon their own cultures, but generally into clans. If I'm not mistaken, our Taino family calls them Yucayekes. What does your particular people refer to your structure as? That's what you should be determining and explaining, not trying to talk about how all melanated people was done in by the white man, because that's not true. First of all, like I said, there were dark-skinned melanated people that were doing it, indigenous folks too. Secondly, indigenous nations were fighting against each other. And in many instances, Europeans weren't overpowering indigenous nations. They were simply taking advantage of the rivalries and political divisions that already existed. And then thirdly, and this is what a lot of our very misinformed family likes to talk about, there were some indigenous nations that practiced enslavement of other indigenous nations. But that's not all indigenous nations, and that has nothing to do with phenotype or skin tone. Once again, nations were engaged in this. And as race became more prevalent, you started to see more expressions through different means that we could contemporarily refer to as racism. But it's outrageous to claim or assert that there was some united Aboriginal nation that white people just came and overpowered and decimated. Stop the generic unification language. That's not how it was, and that's not how it is right now. I'm Nanhiganuk. They call us Narragansett. We were fighting with Pequots and Mohegans. We were fighting with Pokanokets. All of us were fighting here, and that's where the Europeans were able to take advantage of those sorts of things because of our political rivalries and divisions. But we weren't one big united Aboriginal nation, and most of us are related. Most of us are related. And the same thing is today. There's no big unified thing. So I really want to say we have to do away with this sort of conglomerated unity thing. There's no conglomerated unity. That's never the way it's been. There was unity by different people deciding to work together, and that's what needs to happen today. But there was no big conglomerated, unified Aboriginal nation. That's nonsense. And we need to do away with that because it's simply not a realistic claim to make around what was going on when Europeans arrived here. There was never any united Aboriginal nation, and there's not one now. I'm a Meshipag Nahiganse from the Nanhignuk Sachendom. My people's lands are now in a place that they call Rhode Island, and that's where we're from. We have good relations with the nations that are around us, but by no means should you assume that because we have a similar skin tone or the curl in our hair is similar or our nose is a similar side, that there's more affinity for you other than a shared experience we may have than for one of my tribal members who happens to have European heritage. Of course, I'm more connected to that tribal member than I am to you. We share a bloodline. We share a heritage. We share a culture. Despite what the skin tone looks like, I don't know you from a hole in the wall. And that's just being honest and real. Once again, we can relate on the experience that melanated people have had in this place called the United States and in this Western society because of racism. Absolutely, we can connect on those grounds. But you should not expect a stronger relationship than I would have with someone in my own family or in my own tribe who might look European that I know have a family connection with. It's absurd. It's absurd, and we have to get that notion out of our head. And you should feel like you're going to insult someone if you don't know them and you approach them in that manner. So, that point being, there was never any united Aboriginal nation. Get that conversation out of our dialogue. Now let's get to our last 2 points, right? And I'm going to just recap once again. Moors on Indians, that's the first one. Second, race is a social construct that was introduced into American society after the Bacon's Rebellion and after King Philip's War, 1675-1676. Third, phenotype is not determinant of indigenous heritage either way. You can't say, well, someone's too light-skinned and they don't have a feature, so they can't be indigenous. You can't say someone's too dark-skinned and their nose is too wide, so they can't be indigenous to these lands, to these Americas. Just ignorance. Fourth, Indian is a political status. It's not a racial designation. So just switch Indian with foreign national and then ask the same question, see if it makes any sense whatsoever. Fifth, there was never any united Aboriginal nation. That's just not the way things are. And that's not the way they were, and that's not the way they're going to be. Let's get rid of this pie in the sky foolishness. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if we all conglomerate, who's expecting my nation to go underneath them? We're not going underneath anyone. And I imagine that other nations probably feel the same way. They're not coming up underneath us. So we're already causing division because we're not going up underneath anyone, and I don't care what anyone says. Neither do my people. Neither do any of the other nations that I deal with. We can work together, we can collaborate, we can confederate, but as far as any nation coming up under us going up under any other nation, you must be out your mind. We don't need no leaders. We lead ourselves. We can work together. Let's get to our last 2 points, and this is where the law really came into play, understanding this. Treaties and land rights are specific to tribal nations. Treaties and land rights are specific to tribal nations. Nations form treaties. Nations control the land. And then based upon the structure of that nation, the chief, the council, whoever, clan mothers, whoever had authority. But it's the tribal nation. So you as an individual cannot run around just asserting that you're enforcing the treaty rights or you have land. That's outrageous. And when you see quote unquote Indians, and then once again, that's a political status. When you see Indians doing that, what they're really doing is asserting the authority that has been granted by their tribal nation under the treaty. And if their tribal nation still says they can do it, then they can do it. So that's where the argument comes in. But if you're not even a part of a tribal nation or associated with one, if you're just running around based off of your heritage and still just an American, because that's all you are, you're just an American until you're with a tribal nation, you're just an American. If you're not with a tribal nation, then you have no business talking about treaty rights or land rights. You're a U.S. citizen. That's what your rights are, the Bill of Rights, and whatever the state or Fed say you can do, or the Commonwealth or the district. Well, that's what you have. But you don't have any right or authority to talk about treaties and land rights if you're not even with the tribal nation. And then if you are with the tribal nation, you have to conduct yourself according to what the tribal nation says. So you still can't assert it unless the tribal nation says you can assert it. And then that tribal nation has to have the right to tell you you can assert those rights. So see how deep this gets? But it by no means is it anything individual. By no means is your blood heritage entitle you to anything. And I think that that's really what the issue is. Under American law, there's all of these sorts of entitlements that U.S. citizens have because of the Bill of Rights and things of that nature. But that's just under American law. Once you get outside of American law, you're going by the law of those nations that you're dealing with. And if you're not claiming to be a U.S. citizen, if you're not claiming to be American, then whose laws are you going underneath? And if you're saying you're going underneath your own laws, well, then you don't have any authority or jurisdiction at all because no other nation has to pay you any mind. You're an individual. Why does the U.S. have to listen to what you say? Why do other indigenous nations have to listen? You just got here. You're maybe what, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years old? And the U.S. has been going, what, 1776? So 250 years? Why does something that's been going on for 250 years need to pay any attention to one person who's been here for 30, 40, 50, 60 years? You don't have any clout. You don't have any what's the term I'm looking for? Any leverage? Who cares what you say? And then you're quoting laws that other nations created to justify yourself. You sound like a complete fool. Nations, tribal nations assert treaties and land rights. And if you're not associated officially with any tribal nation, and if you haven't been granted any power or authority by that tribal nation expressly and prior to you trying to exercise it, because you don't get to go and say, well, I'm going to do this on behalf of the tribe without getting permission from the tribe first, that is nonsense. If you're not with the tribe, and if you're not empowered by the tribe, you have no treaties or land rights to assert. And if the tribe doesn't have those powers to assert in the first place because of specific ties to those lands or specific ties to those treaties, then there's nothing in existence. They get rid of this generic stuff. You don't get anything just because you're an Indian other than what the law says. And treaties talk about specific types of Indians. Narragansett Indians, Pokanoket Indians, Cherokee Indians, Lenape Indians, whatever it is, there's specific types of Indians that have specific rights to specific treaties and specific lands. And it's not individual. It has nothing to do with you as the individual. You don't get to assert it because that's what you feel. You don't get to assert it because you read something in a European book. You don't get to assert it because you think you studied a little something. You don't have any of that. None of you have any of those rights. If you hear me talk about them, it's because the council has empowered me to speak on behalf of the council of the Mashipag Nahiganset Chippewa to express what the council has authorized me to express, because the council was empowered by the clans of the tribe who collectively came together, who are all blood heritage descendants of the people they called Nanhignuk. Proven, no question whatsoever, and appointed by the tribe specifically because my particular clan descends from individuals who were acknowledged as treaty signers when Europeans arrived here. That's why you hear me speak. Not because I'm an Indian. Not because I'm Aboriginal. Not because the white man. Because the law and history and blood heritage and tribal authority allows me to speak. It has nothing to do with my individual wants or desires. And that's where you all, if you're Indians, need to start understanding and acting like. You need to start acting like Indians. If you're going to be an Indian, and an Indian doesn't assert things on behalf of their tribal nation, they move in support and in accordance with what their tribal nation says. So 6, treaties and land rights are specific to tribal nations, not individuals. And if you're not even with a tribal nation, and if that tribal nation doesn't have that specific treaty right or that specific land right, then you don't have it. And you need to stop that because it's embarrassing and you're causing issues for the tribal nations. The last point I'll make today, and 25 minutes, not too bad. See if we can keep this right about a half an hour. The last point I'll make today is that it has to start with you getting with your individual history, heritage, and narrative and asserting what's there. You cannot randomly pick things out of the law and say that they apply to you. You have to show that they're specific to you, that there was a harm specifically done to you. So you can't talk about what the 5 civilized tribes did if you're not from one of the 5 civilized tribes. You also can't hold nations that aren't one of the 5 civilized tribes accountable for what the 5 civilized tribes did. That's where the individuality comes in. What is your individual history? What is your individual heritage? What are your individual ties? What are the individual things that protect you? And then how can you individually assert them? You have to have, and this is where they get into all of the conversation around standing. Do you even have the authority or the right to even speak in these regards? And once again, when we start having people willy-nilly talk about Aboriginal or, African or treaty rights or what the white man did, you're automatically wiped off the playing field. You're not even a part of the game from a legal perspective. From the perspective of the law, you're not even part of the game. And let me be very clear. The issue is the law. If you want to know what happened to our people, we didn't understand what was going on in terms of how the law was being interpreted, and we didn't understand how to argue back in that space. Once Amaguatu and I got into understanding the law, we realized, it's not that this is the white man's law, it's that we're totally ignorant of it. And then further, even if we know some of the general concepts, we don't understand the procedures, how the game's played. So let me lay it out like this. We're like the guy that shows up to the basketball court, never played ball, but watched it on YouTube, read a few books on it, saw some of his family members play in the past, and now he's come to the ball court, and he wants to be, first of all, he wants to be the first pick on the team, all right? And then secondly, he wants to complain when, what do you mean I can't carry? What do you mean that's a carry? What do you mean that's a double dribble? He wants to complain when he doesn't know the rules and then gets caught in violation of the rules and loses the game. That's what a lot of y'all look like, that person. Show up to the basketball court, saw them play basketball on YouTube, read about it, saw some of your family members, studied it up. But you ain't went to play to no AAU, you ain't played in no leagues, you ain't did none of that. Here you are, now you want to play. And when you get called for travel, called for out of bounds, now you want to whine and complain about how the white man's, picking on you because of your skin tone. It's nonsense. And we need to cut it out. If you want to look individually, you need to look at what your individual experience, history, tie is, heritage, all of that. Some of y'all out there might have been the slave masters, to be quite honest. My people might got issues with you, and you might look just like me. But that might be who your ancestors are. Some of them might look like what y'all are calling a Mongoloid and be your third or fourth cousins. Some of y'all are actually from Africa or Europe. But it's about your individual narrative, and that's what we all need to be getting back to if you're looking for that space. So I'm going to close this out. Just run through the 7 points of clarity. 7 points of clarity. First, Moors on Indians. Not even going to get into it. Moors on Indians. Secondly, race is a social construct that was introduced into American society after the Bacon's Rebellion. So stop operating through that paradigm when you're talking about Aboriginal stuff. Third, phenotype does not determine Indian heritage. It's just simply not. It doesn't do it. You need to know people's blood heritage, who they are, where they come from, what their experience is to determine who they are. Fourth, Indian is a political status, not a racial designation. So once again, just replace the term Indian with foreign national and then make all of those statements that you make and see how outrageous you sound, or those questions you ask and see how ignorant you sound asking the questions. Fifth, there was never any united Aboriginal nation. So stop that madness. Stop trying to create it. None of the traditional nations are getting with it. None of us are putting ourselves underneath any supreme leader, because we know that's where it's all leading to. Back in the day, if you weren't with a tribal nation, then you were considered an outcast. And ain't no one following the outcast. What's wrong with y'all? Why would a tribal nation that... Stop. That's American nonsense. You're going to be whatever you want to be. There was never any united Aboriginal nation. Please stop it. 6, treaties and land rights are specific to tribal nations. You as an individual cannot insert it unless you have been empowered or authorized, which means you have to first be associated officially with the tribal nation, and that tribal nation has to have the authority to do that. If neither of those things are in place, then stop talking about treaty rights and land rights. You're a U.S. citizen. Conduct yourself accordingly. And then lastly, it all comes down to your individual history, narrative, experience. That's what's going to fill you, and you cannot generically claim things that happen historically or legally and expect to get any remedy. It has to be something that specifically harmed you. You have to have been harmed individually, and you can't assert claims on behalf of other people. You can't do it. It's absolute. Take it out of you feeling like a victim and look at the general space of things. What if people just randomly started asserting claims for people without those people's knowledges and then getting awards on their behalf and then keeping the money? Then what? Now you're complaining that the system shouldn't allow that to happen to you. How are you just going to let someone random come and just... So it's the same. It doesn't change because now you're the person who was injured. And this is the thing that was so key. The law is the law. The law is the law. It's not the white man's law. Quote unquote, the white man might be having more knowledge of the law, so they utilize it to your detriment, but it's not his law. You can utilize it the same way he can. So educate yourself, inform yourself, get rid of this arrogance that goes on, that is all about me. The only individual thing in this whole Aboriginal conversation is who you are and what your experience is. After that, once you figure that out, there's a whole bunch of things that are in place here that have been around for a very, very, very long time that ain't changing because you individually feel like it ain't moving the way you think it should. That's an American mindset. Remember, that's what they came over here. Most of them, a lot of them is indentures and slaves and criminals, and then they got over here and decided they didn't want things to go the way that they were going. They wanted to do something new. That's the same mindset we see going on. So those are the 7 points of clarity. Hope that this message is finding y'all blessed. I think I'm going to be heading down to the Mashantucket Pequot powwow later on today. There's Scamitson. Show my face, pay my respects. Doing what's necessary to heal past divisions and build new relationships amongst the tribal nations. And that's because I'm actually associated, took the time to engage and connect myself with the tribal nation to be able to do that, encouraging you all to do the same. 7 points of clarity. Many blessings and peace to y'all. And hope that this is informative. And hope that you all are continuing to stay blessed, continuing to honor Creator above, continuing to honor the ancestors that walked before you, and continue to walk, as we say, in a good way. Wigwusin, Winnie Mosquito, Kapish Ganache. Good day and good medicine, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Oh.